All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we will officially begin our broadcast here. I'm Dan Weiser, the co-founder and artistic director of Classicopia, and along with my co-founder, Marcia Colligan, the president, we welcome you to this wonderful broadcast. It's a 20th anniversary celebration, and it will be on the life and wonderful music of Frederic Chopin. Classicopia started almost 20 years ago today, sometime a Sunday in June, and it might have been this exact Sunday. And Marcia decided to have me come to her living room there in Hanover, New Hampshire, to play a Chopin Salon. It was a three-part session at the time, and we filled up that living room. And out of that came the birth of Classicopia, with chamber music concerts almost every month, and other salons that we would do for many, many years. And even though I moved away from the Hanover area now since 2009, I believe, it's 11 years, we've been able to maintain these concerts pretty much on a monthly basis, maybe taking the winters off because it's tough to get up there. But we are really thankful for all of you and all of your support during these years. A couple of really important people to thank, special friends. All of our board members from Classicopia who do just a wonderful job. Besides Marcia, there's Patrick Colligan and John Colligan, two of her sons, Barbara Nyholm, and Kathy Rorison, who is also our director of our volunteers and has done just a wonderful job putting together these volunteers over almost the whole 20 years, and also Sean Rubin on the board. Other thanks, I want to thank the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation for many, many years of financial support, helping Classicopia stay alive during all sorts of difficult times. And we thank them for seeing the greatness of chamber music, intimate chamber music. Special donors as well, John and Dr. Lacey Colligan, Ray and Cynthia Barrett, and my mom, Helen Weiser. Thank you for continued support over many, many years to make this all possible. Also want to thank some of our special concert hosts, especially Marilyn and Al Austin Nelson, who have hosted way too many concerts. And I also stay with them almost every time I come up there. Incredible people who have an incredible home and are just amazing folks. So thank you, Marilyn and Al, if you're watching. Also, Gail and John Wasson, who have hosted concerts before and are great, great supporters, helped us get our Lebanon series going at the First Congregational Church. Faye and David Bisno, who have hosted almost every year as well at their beautiful home in Hanover. And Pat and Rod Vitti, who used to host all the time in Quechee, Vermont before they ran off to Florida. But they have been great supporters. Even in Florida, I've been able to go down and play down in the Naples area where they are. So thank you, Pat and Rod, if you're watching today. And I also want to thank one patron, Charlotte Sanborn, who I know is here, who I think has attended just about every Classicopia concert, which is a lot over the last 20 years. So she gets the prize for just being the greatest of our fans. Thank you, Charlotte, for being at all of them. And thank you all for taking a couple hours today to be with us as we explore this. And again, as I said, this is live, and if there's a little breakup in the sound and the visuals don't sync up, it's probably just a little bit of a vagaries of the internet, and hopefully will correct itself very quickly. If it doesn't, try to send me a comment. I don't know if I can do much about it, but I'm hoping that all of you are hearing this right now. And if for some reason anything is too loud or too soft, you can also make a comment. But I'm trusting that it's going to work. And there again might just be moments where the weather gets in the way and they're just a regular stoppage. But we'll try to make it through. And I hope you enjoy the life and music of Frederic Chopin. Claude Debussy, one of the great French composers, said this about Chopin. He said, "Chopin is the greatest of all of us, for with the piano alone, he discovered everything." And it is a remarkable thing that Chopin basically only wrote piano music. He didn't write great operas. That's what people said you had to do to be a great composer, or symphonies. He did write a couple piano concertos, but those were actually fairly early in his life, as well as a piano trio. He wrote a cello sonata at the end of his life, but basically, it was all piano music. He believed that the piano could say it all. And for pianists, Chopin is the greatest of all the gods. Chopin himself said this about his music. He said, Bach was like an astronomer who, with the help of ciphers, found the most wonderful stars. Beethoven embraced the universe with the power of his spirit. I do not climb so high. A long time ago, I decided that my universe would be the soul and the heart of man. And there is something so personal about this music that touches your soul at its greatest. There's a wonderful quote by Oscar Wilde who really says it all. He said, "After playing Chopin, I feel as if I have been weeping over sins that I never committed and mourning over tragedies that were not my own." So he is that romantic composer par excellence, and he used forms from his native Poland, but also combined them with waltzes from Vienna and other French ideas, and came up with his unique way of performing. I'll talk a little bit later about his teaching style and his piano style, which was absolutely revolutionary. Really changed the way that we play piano, using our whole bodies and breathing as if we're singers. That was not always the way it was done, but Chopin brought this beast, this piano, to life in such a way that really made music breathe and the piano breathe in a wonderful way. Now, Chopin was born in 1810, and he would unfortunately die in 1849, so he only lives 39 years. It's another remarkable story, like Mozart, who died at 35, that these composers could do so much in such a short time. As many of you have heard me say about Mozart, Tom Lear, the great satirist, said once about Mozart, he said, "It's a sobering thought to think that when Mozart was my age, he had been dead for 5 years." I have to say that for Chopin now. He would have been almost 15 years dead since he's my age. But still, incredible story. His father, Nicolas Chopin, was born in France and had come over around the time of the French Revolution, maybe just wanted to escape the craziness, and headed to Poland and became a tutor, a French tutor there, for the Countess Louise Skarbek in a little town called Zelazowa Wola. Sorry for any of the Polish people out there. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. Not far from Warsaw. That's where he was stationed. And while he was at that house, he happened to fall in love with one of the housekeepers there named Justina Krzyżanowska, who would then become Chopin's mother. They would get married in 1806. They would have one daughter, Louise, in 1807, and then Chopin born on March 1st, 1810, the same year that the family would actually move to Warsaw. So Chopin himself didn't spend a lot of time in Zelazowa Wola, but there is still a Chopin museum there in the house that he was born in. There were two other daughters born soon after, Isabella and Amelia. Unfortunately, Amelia would die of tuberculosis when she was only 15 years old. She was a very poetic writer already, and Chopin wrote one of his beautiful nocturnes after she died, and the mother apparently only wore black the rest of her life after the death of this Amelia. So there was one great tragedy early on, and of course Chopin himself was a very sickly soul. He had tuberculosis, which he died from, but he probably was never more than 100 pounds his entire life. As Berlioz once said, Chopin was dying all his life. And that's going to be a sort of a recurring trope, sort of the fear of death, the sense that death was coming imminently, that sort of drives a lot of Chopin's music. He would begin piano lessons. His mother was an amateur pianist, and so she started him off first, and then he began, when he was 7 years old, working with a guy named Adalbert Givny. And very soon after, this is a remarkable prodigy, obviously, he writes his first composition, and I want to play that piece for you now. This is from 1817, so 7 years old. It's a Polonaise in G minor, and it appeared in a local newspaper as printed, and this is what the Givny wrote about it. He said, "The composer of this Polish dance, a young boy only 7 years of age, is a true musical genius. Not only does he play the most difficult pieces on the piano with the greatest ease and exceptional taste, but he is also the composer of several dances and variations by which musical experts are constantly amazed, above all given the childish age of their writer. Had that young boy been born in Germany or France, he would doubtless have already attracted the attention of all social spheres. May this mention serve as an indication that geniuses also arise on our soil. It is just the lack of broad publicity that conceals them from the public. So already there was this idea of Chopin as the great Polish star, and that would continue throughout his whole life. So here is this first piece that was published, the Polonaise in G minor, written when Chopin was 7 years old. So that's pretty remarkable for a 7-year-old child. And very quickly, word began to spread around Warsaw about this young genius. And a year later, in 1818, he performed at a charity concert in Warsaw, where he was recognized as the greatest prodigy there in Poland, and received invitations to many different aristocratic homes. And one home that he was into very often was the Grand Duke Constantine. He was the brother of Tsar Alexander I. Russia was at this point in charge of Poland, and Poland was sort of run by this crazy Grand Duke. He was basically insane and probably a sociopath who would sometimes randomly start shooting out of his window at passers-by. But the one thing that would sort of calm him in his violent times was to have Chopin there playing the piano, which is a little frightening for a young kid to have to sit there and play for a guy who is perhaps going to go start shooting people. But already we see Chopin's music, the ability for him to just move people and bring them to a different state of being. At around 1819, his father starts teaching at the Warsaw Lyceum, a kind of private boarding school at a nice palace there, the Casimir Palace in Warsaw. And Chopin was a boarder there and was very quickly taken in by other boys there who remembered listening to him. Oftentimes would play the piano. Here's one who wrote, "When I arrived as a boarder, Chopin was a small boy of very fragile health. At dusk, in time free from our studies, we recounted events from Polish history, such as the death of King Wojciech and battles waged by our leaders, and it was all played out by the young Chopin on the piano. Sometimes we cried to this music, and Żywny was enchanted by his playing." So already he was sort of making Polish history through his music, and we'll see that especially in his ballades, that way brings to life that kind of epic history of Poland. In 1822, he begins composition lessons with Joseph Elsner, who's actually a real solid musician who actually would start the Warsaw Conservatory a few years later. And again, he would play for some charity concerts for this new conservatory in 1825. Tsar Alexander actually came to some of those concerts, loved the music, gave him a very precious diamond ring that Chopin kept all his life. But it was while Chopin was just at the Warsaw Conservatory that the first signs of tuberculosis showed up in him. He got quite sick there, and then a year later, his sister dies of tuberculosis. And he decides at this point to begin to travel to other places. So in 1828, he makes his first trip outside of Poland. He goes off to Berlin. He actually meets Mendelssohn while he's there, and they would have a little bit of a relationship all their lives. And he was kind of amazed in Germany by the reception that he got. The Germans seemed to love listening to him play, even though some of them complained that he played very quietly and didn't have as much virtuosity as other pianists they knew. But in general, they loved him. And he said once, "The Germans are amazed at me, and I am amazed at them for finding anything to be amazed about." So a little bit modest about his abilities at this point. But he recognized that there was a public out there that really wanted to hear his music. And in 1829, he would actually hear Paganini, the great violinist who came to Warsaw. Paganini was one of these incredible virtuosos. Some said he had made a pact with the devil in order to play so beautifully. And in fact, after he died, they exhumed his body to make sure it was there and not gone off to hell. But Paganini influenced a lot of these young romantic composers, Liszt and Schumann and Chopin. They all heard sort of the spirit and the soul of this guy, and they wanted to do on the piano or for other instruments what he was doing for the violin. Let me get to a waltz that Chopin writes around this time in 1829. There's a very famous waltz in B minor. He never published this. It was published later. In fact, there's several pieces that he did not want published. He told Julian Fontana, his good friend, "After I die, don't publish any of my works." Thankfully, Fontana did not listen to him, and his Fantasy Impromptu and several of the famous waltzes were published by Fontana. And so that's why they sometimes have late opus numbers. This is opus 69, but that doesn't mean it was written quite late. It was actually one of his first waltzes he wrote. Here's the beautiful waltz in B minor. the wonderful Chopin Waltz in B minor, written in 1829, when Chopin had returned to Warsaw from Berlin. Now, in 1830, Chopin plays his first big major public concert in Warsaw, his concerto in F minor. He wrote 2 concertos around this time. But in that year, in November, the Polish insurrection against Russia begins as the Poles try to rise up to get their independence. It would ultimately be not successful, and some horrible things that the Russians did to the Poles in the next year or so. But Chopin is told that he should probably get out. He's such a frail person, and even though he wants to fight for this independence, he's going to be of no use. And many of his friends say you'll be more useful going to other places and spreading the word about the Polish the people as they rise up. So he heads off first for Vienna and spends a few months in early 1831 in Vienna. But it's not a great time there in Vienna. Let me give you a little bit of the story behind Vienna here, if I can find it. Here we are. He doesn't love too much his time in Vienna. He says, the people here are not my people. They're good people, but they live out of habit. They do everything too orderly, insipidly, in mediocrity, which kills me. Mediocrity I would not even like to feel. But there were people who did love his music. One review said, an artist unheralded has appeared on the musical horizon much like a brilliant meteor. Again, some people began to complain, and this would be a continuous thing, that he was not very virtuosic. You couldn't always hear him in a big hall, and so he would often later on only play concerts in intimate spaces, much like we like to do with Classicopia. Whereas his friend Franz Liszt loved the adulation of the public, Chopin really almost preferred to play by himself. He didn't want to have too many people listening, but he did say, here in Vienna they are accustomed to the loud blare of virtuosi, but that's not my way of playing. I know I can never do that, but I believe that musicians and women prefer my way of playing. So interestingly, he knew that there was a market for his softer style, and he was absolutely correct about that. And I want to give a sense of one of these pieces that would have been one of these very soft pieces. This is his Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2, written in 1831 while he's there in Vienna. And I'll read you a little criticism about it afterwards, but give you a sense of the beauty of this music. Here's a very famous E-flat major Nocturne. That's the wonderful Chopin E-flat Nocturne by Chopin, Opus 9, number 2. Now, there was one reviewer who really did not like Chopin, and I'd like to read some of his reviews just because you can just imagine Chopin getting so annoyed at these reviews. It was a guy named Ludwig Rellstab, who was a well-known German music critic. In fact, he was the one who gave the name Moonlight Sonata to Beethoven's work. He liked a lot of Beethoven's music, and you can understand if he liked Beethoven, the power of Beethoven, that he seemed a little confused by what Chopin was doing with his kind of more effeminate sound that didn't really just attack the instrument. But one of the most fun, not funny for Chopin, but kind of mean, was about that last nocturne. Rellstab compared Chopin's nocturne to that of John Field, who's a composer we don't know much about now, but was an Irish composer who also wrote nocturnes. And Rellstab wanted Chopin to write more like Field. Here's how he said it. Whereas Mr. Field smiles when he plays, Mr. Chopin makes a snickering grimace. Where Field sighs, Chopin groans. When Field shrugs his shoulders, Mr. Chopin arches his back like a cat. Field adds a little spice to his meal. Chopin throws in a handful of pepper. Furthermore, Chopin has again not failed to choose the most remote keys, B flat major, B minor, B major, that's in the other parts of this Opus 9, and E flat major. But in this latter key, he also has such modulations that one feels himself as if in a labyrinth. If one were to hold Field's charming romances before a crooked mirror so that every finer expression is exaggerated, then one would get Chopin's handiwork. We beseech Mr. Chopin, who is really not without talent, to return to truth and nature. So at least he recognized he had some talent. But he would go on a couple of years later when Chopin put out his etudes, which are incredibly difficult piano pieces designed to sort of work every finger and make every single part of the hand equal and working in a wonderful way. But Rellstab said, only someone with mutilated fingers may succeed in tackling these etudes. But anyone who is not in such a position should steer well clear of them if there is not a surgeon in the vicinity. Chopin actually responded to that one with a little letter of his own. Said, "You are, sir, a true evil man, and not worthy to be born by this sacred earth." So I can imagine they were really going back and forth together. One more time, Rellstab said about his mazurkas that were published the next year, he talked about the ear-splitting dissonances, forced transitions, grating modulations, an unbearable distortion of melody and rhythm. And decided he would only tear the music to shreds because he couldn't stand it. So it's as if, for those who remember the Seinfeld show, every time that Rellstab, you can imagine Chopin saying, Rellstab! But it was not the norm. Most people really did recognize the greatness in Chopin's music. So let me play one more nocturne to give you the sense of this. This is one that was not published in Chopin's life, the C-sharp minor one. I'm not sure why he wouldn't publish it because it's so gorgeous. Those of you pianists, this was played in the very beginning when the guy was recording as bombs were going off in Warsaw during World War II. Here's the lovely posthumous nocturne in C-sharp minor. Lovely. Again, not a piece that he published in his lifetime, but thankfully Julian Fontana did, so that we all have it and can play this incredible music. All right, so we are at the point now where Chopin heads to Stuttgart. Let me get my stuff here. In 1831, before he gets to Paris, he spends a couple months in Stuttgart. And it's while he's in Stuttgart that he hears about the horror that is going on back in Russia. And he writes kind of in his diary, in his notebook, just an explosion of horror at what he reads. And it would sort of be this spirit that would impel the ballade in G minor, which I'm going to play next. And after this, we'll take just a short few-minute break. So if you want to go up and get water or go to the bathroom, we'll do that. But I'll take a second after the ballade. It's such a big work. This is Marcia's favorite work, so I have to. But behind it really stems from the anger that Chopin feels that Russia is sort of destroying the Polish heritage by coming in there and destroying the insurrection. Here's what he writes. Oh God, do you exist? You're there and you don't avenge it? How many more Russian crimes do you want? Or maybe you are a Russian too. My poor father, the dear old man, might be starving. My mother not able to buy bread. Perhaps my sisters have succumbed to the ferocity of Muscovite soldiery let loose. Oh, Father, what a comfort for your old age. Poor suffering mother, have you borne a daughter only to see a Russian violate her very bones? Mockery, has even Amelia's grave been respected? Trampled, thousands of other corpses are over her grave. Oh, what has happened, the poor girl? Here alone, come keep away your ears. I'll heal the wounds of the present, remind you of the past. The days when there were no Russians, the days when the only Russians were a few who were very anxious to please you, and you were laughing at them because I was there. Have you your mother? Such a cruel mother. Mine is so kind. Perhaps I have no mother. Perhaps some Russian has killed her, murdered her. My sisters, raving, resist. Father in despair, nothing he can do. And I am here useless. I am here with empty hands. Sometimes I can only groan and suffer and pour out my despair at the piano. God, shake the earth, let it swallow up the men of this age. So there's a lot of anger, obviously, and suffering in that. And Chopin sort of took that and used it, I think, to impel all of the great music that we're going to hear now in the Chopin, the ballade. I just want to read a couple more things here, if I can find it on my many things here. He also wrote around this time, I am gay on the outside, especially around my own folk. But inside, something gnaws at me. Some presentiment, anxiety, dreams or sleeplessness, melancholy, indifference, a desire for life, and in the next instant, a desire for death. Some kind of sweet peace, some kind of numbness, and absent-mindedness. So in that spirit, over the next couple years, he works on this ballade. It takes him about 3 years to really get it in the right form. So it's not published until 1835 when he's already in Paris. But it's written, the beginnings of it, the gestations are in this period. And Adam Mickiewicz, who was a famous poet, a ballad writer in Polish, Chopin knew his stuff, his writing, and in a sense he tried to translate what the ideas of Mickiewicz, these epic ballads of great epic heroism by Poland, and of course the tragedy that has always been Poland, as different countries are coming at it. It all comes together in this remarkable work, which again, if you saw The Pianist, that is a piece that he is playing when the German soldiers come along and could kill him, but they are so moved by the piece that they don't. And so it has this kind of universal humanity about it. So I'll play the Chopin Ballade. It's about 5 or 6 minutes long. And after this, we'll just take a few-minute break so I can take some water. And if there's any questions at that point, please do ask them in the comment section, and I'll take a second to try to answer them. Here's the Ballade in G minor. This is Opus 23. That's for you, Marcia. One of the great, great works of all time. Just the power of that. That was more Lisztian than Chopin. One of the few pieces that Chopin wrote with that kind of anger and drive in it. And he could that often without fainting. All right, so we have just reached the point where Chopin is going to head into Paris. And that's going to be where he will spend the rest of his life. He really doesn't get back to Poland ever again. And he only sees his parents one more time. They meet in Dresden, I believe, or Switzerland. I can't remember. But he would not go back. Once he gets to Paris, he really becomes a citizen of Paris in many ways. And there's a wonderful quote about Paris at this time in 1830. There was, of course, a revolution in 1830, made famous from Les Mis. But there was also the sort of a revolution in arts that came a little bit later to France than it did in Germany. The Romantic period starts more in the first decades in Germany, but it's not until 1830 when Chopin is there and Liszt is there and Victor Hugo is writing that it really reaches its peak. And here's what George Brandes wrote in his Main Currents in 19th Century Literature, a wonderful quote. He said, "All at once in Paris, the votaries of the different arts felt that they were brothers. Musicians studied the literature both of their own country and other nations. Poets drew and painted. Poems were read in painters' and sculptors' studios. Delacroix's pupils hummed Hugo's ballads as they stood at their easels. The authors Dumas and Hugo, Delacroix the painter, the sculptor David d'Angers, the composers Berlioz and Zuber, the critics Saint-Beuve and Gautier, and Marie Dorval, the scenic artists, and corresponding to them, the two great demonic virtuosi, Chopin and Liszt. All these make their appearance together. One and all proclaim the gospel of nature and of passion. And around them assemble groups who apprehend and cultivate literature and art in a spirit akin to theirs. These young romanticists felt like brothers, like fellow conspirators. They felt that they were the sharers in a sweet and invigorating secret, and this gave to the works of the school a flavor, an aroma like that of the noble wines of a year when the vintage has been more than ordinarily good. Ah, that bouquet of 1830, there is no other in the century which can be compared with it." So Chopin picked a really good time to arrive in Paris, just as things were kind of fomenting into this great artistic maelstrom. Here's how Chopin, when he first arrives in September of 1831, he said he ends up taking a fifth-floor tenement home on the Boulevard Poissonnier, and he writes back to his parents, "I have a small room beautifully furnished in mahogany with a balcony boulevard from which I can from Montmartre to the Pantheon and along the whole of this beautiful world. Many envy me the view, but no one the stairs." And those of you who've been to Paris know that those 5 floors of climbing can hurt. But that's what he did for a while. And he began to write about just how amazing Paris was. It was just everything was going on. The bustle was amazing. He said, "There is here the greatest splendor, the greatest shabbiness, the greatest virtue, the greatest vice, posters warning of venereal diseases everywhere you walk, more shouting, screaming, rumbling, and mud than one could possibly imagine. One melts into this paradise, and it is convenient in this respect that nobody asks how anyone lives." So you could almost go anonymously through the streets, and there was the rich and the poor all together. Again, later on, he said, "Paris is everything one could wish for. You could amuse yourself, become bored, laugh, cry, do whatever you please, and nobody looks at you. For here there are thousands doing just the same as you, and each in his own way. I don't know if there are more pianists than in Paris. I don't know if anywhere there are more asses and more virtuosos than here." So there were a lot of other great pianists, including Liszt, but many more. And so Chopin really had to kind of make his way as a pianist to show a little bit that he could play fast if needed to. But that's not how he would make his big claim to fame. I'm going to play a piece that he writes right when he first gets to Paris. It's his famous waltz in E-flat major, opus 18, used for all sorts of ballet recitals now. But this had a little bit of that sort of Viennese waltz flavor in it, but was also his big introduction to Paris. that's a much more extroverted Chopin than we're used to, and really I think was a calling card for himself to try to get his name out there, to get some concerts, and also to get some students. This was a time when he was trying to make some money, and he needed to impress enough people to get some students. And he did begin to get quite a few very good students. In fact, he does one very successful concert in 1832, and he begins playing for some high society. I want to read a little quote. He was very smart about his ability here. Let's see if I can find it here. I'll find it one of these days. Here we go. He writes to his friend back in Warsaw in 1832. I have got into the highest society here in Paris. I sit with ambassadors, princes, ministers. I even don't know how it came about, because I did not try for it. But it is a most necessary thing for me, because good taste is supposed to depend on it. At once you have a bigger talent if you have been heard at the English or Austrian embassy. You play better if the Princess Vaudemont was your protector. So he was playing the game, getting in with the aristocrats, networking as he had to do in order to get out there. But he still recognized that he had a lot to learn, and you got to give him credit for this. He writes this: though this is only my first year among the artists here, I do have their friendship and respect. One proof of respect is that even people with huge reputations dedicate their compositions to me before I do so to them. Pixis has inscribed to me his last variations with a military band. People compose variations on my themes. Kalkbrenner used my mazurka in this way. The pupils of the conservatory, Moscheles pupils, Hertz and Kalkbrenner, in a word, finished artists, take lessons from me and couple my name with that of Field. In short, if I were stupider than I am, I should think myself at the apex of my career. Yet I know how much I still lack and to reach perfection. I see it the more clearly now that I live only among first-rank artists, and I know what each one of them lacks. So very perceptive writing by Chopin. And one of these people who he began to know quite well was the great Franz Liszt. And he and Liszt would become sort of frenemies their whole life. Very close at times, but there were times when they were so opposite in the way that they dealt with the public. As Chopin once said to Liszt, Chopin said to Liszt, I am not fit for public playing. The public frightens me. Its breath chokes me. I am paralyzed by its inquisitive gaze and frightened by all those strange faces. But you are meant for it. If you can't win the love of the public, you can astonish it and deafen it. Which is a little slight backhanded slap at him at the loudness that which Liszt played. But many pianists and other composers recognized that Chopin, even though he played quietly, was a real poet. Ferdinand Hiller, who was a well-known pianist at the time, said, when playing, Chopin would give only himself, and that in a particularly peculiar way. No one has ever touched the keys like he did. No one has ever produced sounds in such countless tints and modifications. He knew how to combine rhythmic playing with freedom in such a wondrous way that his melodies always seemed the fruits of instant improvisations and momentary inspiration. All perspectives and views on the qualities of his playing disappeared, and only one thought dominated. That is Chopin playing. Even the lack of that impressive power with which Thalberg and Liszt conquered their audiences constituted with Chopin just one more charm. He delighted listeners with his unfathomed mysteriousness. And that really sums up, I think, Chopin's way. But Hiller also said that when Chopin's fingers over the note, it was like a snake opening its mouth to swallow a rabbit whole. And I'll talk a little bit later about Chopin's novel way of fingering and the use of his arms. But there were clearly people that saw these the Liszt and Chopin. Another reviewer said, in 1835, Liszt represented the amazing type of the virtuoso. while Chopin for me was the personification of poetry. The former played in pursuit of effect. Chopin, by contrast, did not appear to be even aware of the audience, but rather to be following an internal voice. And so there was that poetry always in the way that Chopin played. And I wanted to play one incredible work that Chopin wrote at this time. This is his Fantasy Impromptu. Again, a work that Chopin said he didn't want published. There's a lap with the Moonlight Sonata here, if you listen. It's in the same key, and it seems to be Chopin exploring what Beethoven was doing, but in his own unique way. But we don't know why it wasn't published. Luckily, Fontana, this was one of the first pieces that Fontana published after Chopin died. It has these, the first section and the last section, these very tempestuous sides. And in the middle, the most glorious Chopin melody, made famous by I'm Always Chasing Rainbows from the show Irene. It was used as the theme song for that. Now, here's the Fantasy Impromptu, Opus 66, written in 1834. That's the great fantasy impromptu. We thank Julian Fontana for not burning that as Chopin had asked him to do. And we're going to move now to the couple love affairs that Chopin would have. One was with a woman named Maria Wodzinska, and she was the daughter of some family friends who he had known back in Warsaw. And he kind of met up with her in Dresden in 1835. She was 10 years younger than her, so she was probably 17 and he was in his mid-20s. I'm guessing it was more of an infatuation. But at some point he seems to have proposed marriage to her. The parents of Maria Wodzinska got involved. Even though they liked Chopin, they actually considered him like a son. But they knew he was quite sickly, and they were worried about some of the reports they heard of him going off late night into the salons in Paris. And so the mother sort of gives him a 1-year probation to get his life in order there before they agree to the marriage. And she writes him saying, "Avoid late nights in the salons of nobility and look after your health. Everything depends on that." And unfortunately, at some point, it seems that it sort of just disintegrated. But before Chopin left Dresden, he composed a beautiful waltz for her, known as the Farewell Waltz, the waltz in A flat. I want to play that now. Opus 69, number 1. This was a parting gift to Wodzinska. She would then at some point sort of say that it was no good. And he put all of her letters together in a little package that he left after his death, tied up a little thing that said "My Sorrow." But he would soon move on to someone else. But I wanted to play his farewell gift to Maria Wodzinska, the waltz in A flat major. A flat waltz. Wodzinska was actually a pretty good painter, and there's a painting that she did of Chopin that's one of the better ones, along with one by Delacroix, his friend. You can look it up if you look up Wodzinska's painting of Chopin. It's quite good, a watercolor. She would ultimately marry somebody else and actually get divorced and not have the greatest of life, but I guess her parents were right that Chopin wasn't long for this world. But he didn't have too long to pine, because right when the breakup of Wodzinska was happening, he met somebody new, and this was the writer Georges Sand, or Aurora du Devant was her name, but she took the male name Georges as a way to get her books published. And she was a friend of Franz Liszt and Liszt's mistress, Marie Dagout, and they sort of all hooked them up together. I did not go first. This is what Chopin wrote when he first met her. I have met a great celebrity, Madame Dudevant, known as Georges Sand. Her appearance is not to my liking. Indeed, there is something about her which positively repels me. What an unattractive person she is. Is she really a woman? I'm inclined to doubt it. And she did wear the pants and smoke cigars. And there are some that weren't sure in this relationship that would last 8 years who was the man and who was the woman, because Chopin was very effeminate and Sand very masculine, and it seemed like they were sort of an interesting couple. But they remarkably stayed together, although I'm not sure how much of an amorous relationship. I think Sand became kind of a mother figure to Chopin, and I think he needed it as he was sick so much. She really saw the greatness in the poetry in his character and wanted to give him a way to survive. And she had a country home, Nohant, where he would write a lot of his great masterpieces over the next several years. But once they were first together, one of the first things they did was head off to Majorca for a kind of honeymoon. And that was a bit of a disaster because Chopin got quite sick while he was in Majorca. They were staying in a kind of monastery, an abandoned monastery. And this is how Sand wrote about it in her book called My Life, Ma Vie, the story of my life, in which she talked about her time there. And she said, our life in this romantic solitude would have been extremely pleasant. They were there with Sand's two young kids, Maurice and Solange, despite the savage countryside and the nature of its inhabitants. If the sad spectacle of the suffering Chopin and on certain days serious anxiety for his life had not effectively removed any pleasure or benefit from this trip. The great artist was truly a detestable patient. He allowed himself to become completely demoralized. He could endure suffering with courage enough, but he could not conquer the anxieties of his imagination. For him, the cloister was full of terrors and phantoms, even when he felt well. When I would return from my nocturnal explorations in the ruins with my children, I would find him at 10 in the evening, pale at his piano, his eyes haggard, his hair standing almost on end. It would take him several moments to recognize us. This is where he composed the most beautiful of those pages that he modestly entitled The Preludes. And I'm going to play the Raindrop Prelude in a second. These came to him during hours of sunlight and health, but others came to him and were more mournful and broke your heart. There is one, and this is the Raindrop, that came to him on a gloomy, rainy evening, which made the soul frightfully despondent. Maurice and I had left him in a healthy state to go to Palma to buy some necessities. The rains had come. The torrents had overflowed. We arrived home well after nightfall. We were rushing because we knew our patient would worry. His anxiety had been severe, to be sure, but it had frozen into calm despair, and he was playing a marvelous prelude while weeping when we came in. On seeing us come in, he rose, uttered a loud cry, then said with a wild expression and in a strange tone of voice, "Ah, just as I have imagined, you have died." When he had gotten back his bearings and saw that we were much alive, he was sick at the retrospective display of our dangers. He confessed to me later that while waiting for us, he had seen all that in a dream, and no longer able to distinguish dream from reality, he had calmed himself and played the piano, persuading that he had died himself. He saw himself drowned in a lake, heavy ice drops falling rhythmically on his chest, and when I had him listen to the drops of water falling rhythmically on the roof, he denied having heard them. He was even angry at what I translated by the expression imitative harmony. He vehemently protested against the naivete of believing his notes to have been mere oral imitations. His genius, full of the mysterious harmonies of nature, translated them into sublime equivalents in his music. His composition that evening was certainly full of raindrops resonating on the tiles of the monastery, but they were perhaps translated in his imagination and in his music into tears from heaven falling on the heart. So here is the beautiful Raindrop Prelude written when Chopin was almost near death in Majorca. lovely Raindrop Prelude by Chopin, written while he was in Majorca. And it was while he was there, the doctors had actually come to check up on him. And here he said, "The three most celebrated doctors on the island have been to see me recently. One sniffed at what I spat, the second tapped where I spat from, and the third sounded to me and listened as I spat. The first said that I was dying, the second said I was going to die, the third said I was already dead." So it was a tough time, but he wrote that incredible set of preludes. There's 24 of them, and they've become sort of the staple of repertoire. Now, when they get back, Sand and Chopin live for the most part in Nohant during the summers and then in Paris during the winters. And Nohant becomes a center of lots of different great artists. Delacroix, the artist, spends several summers down there, and he and Chopin become very good friends. And Sand actually is, because of the fact that she spent so much time watching him compose, has some of the most beautiful writing about what it was like for Chopin. And she said, this is Sand's writing: "Chopin's music was spontaneous and miraculous. He found it without seeking it, without previous intimation of it. It came upon his piano suddenly, complete, sublime, or it sang in his head during a walk, and he was impatient to hear it himself with the help of the instrument. But then began the most desperate labor that I have ever witnessed. It was a succession of efforts, hesitations, and moments of impatience to recapture certain details of the theme that he could hear in his head. What he had conceived as one piece, he analyzed too much in trying to write it down, and his dismay at his inability to rediscover it in what he thought was its original pure form threw him into a kind of despair. He would lock himself up in his room for whole days at a time, weeping, pacing back and forth, breaking his pens, repeating or changing one bar 100 times, writing and erasing it as many times, and beginning again the next day in desperate perseverance. He sometimes spent 6 weeks on one page, only in the end to write it exactly as he had sketched it on the first draft." That's a really great insight into the process that I think a lot of people do when they're writing poetry or painting or composing music. We try to capture that original idea, and sometimes we sort of work ourselves into a dither and destroy it, and then we have to recompose it back to what it was originally. So we're thankful for Sand for writing some of that down, so we have it. I want to play one of the pieces that he wrote while he was in Nohant. We're getting towards the end of our time here. This is the very famous Polonaise Militaire, the Polonaise in A major, Opus 40, number 1. Again, one of the more virile of pieces that Chopin wrote. that was picked up during the war, World War II, as kind of the fighting song of the Poles as well. Unfortunately, the relationship between Sand and Chopin it lasts for 7 or 8 years, but by 1846 it had started to fade. Sand actually writes one of her books called Lucrezia Floriani that year, which was sort of a very thinly veiled story about a guy named Prince Carol, who was clearly Chopin, and Lucrezia Floriani, who was clearly Georges Sand. And there was a lot of things that were not very nice about Chopin in that book. It seemed to be her way of sort of trying to break up with him in a nice way. When Chopin and everybody who was there, he said, the novel barely held the fig leaf of fiction over the private hell of its protagonists. Delacroix said he was in agony for Chopin as they listened to her read it. Then he later said, I was equally mystified by the victim and the executioner. Madame Sand was perfectly at ease, and Chopin could hardly stop making admiring comments during the reading. Now, maybe Chopin didn't quite understand it, or maybe he just didn't want to talk about it in front of people, and he was sort of embarrassed by what was going on. But that was the beginning of the end for the relationship. There was then a whole soap opera with Sand's daughter, Solange, who at that time gets engaged to a sculptor named Clesinger. Chopin says, this guy's bad news, you shouldn't let it. But Sand says, no, I think he's a good guy. It turns out he's a horrible guy. And at some point, there's a huge brawl that happens at Nohant. Chopin isn't there, between Maurice and Clesinger, and Maurice almost kills Clesinger. And then Sand throws Solange out of the house and won't let her use her carriage. Then Chopin ends up letting her use the carriage. And that sort of infuriates Sand, and she writes him sort of this long breakup letter at that point. He writes to his sister, a kind of interesting letter at that point. It says, it seemed as if she wanted at one stroke to get rid of her daughter and of me, because we were kind of inconvenient to her life. She will correspond with her daughter later, so her maternal heart, which cannot do without some news of her child, will be quieted, and with that she can stifle her conscience. She will believe that she is just, and she will pronounce me an enemy for having taken the side of her son-in-law, whom she cannot endure only because he has married her daughter, and I did all I could to prevent the marriage. She is a strange creature with all her intellect. Some kind of frenzy has come upon her. She messes up her own life. She messes up her daughter's life. With her son, too, it will end badly. I predict it, and I could swear to it. For her own justification, she longs to find something against those who care for her, who have never done her any discourtesy, but whom she cannot bear to see about her, because they are the mirrors of her conscience. Thus, to me, she has not written one word more. She will not come to Paris this winter, nor has she mentioned me at all to her daughter. I do not regret that I helped her through the 8 most difficult years of her life, the years when her daughter was growing up and her son living with his mother. I do not regret what I have suffered, but I am sorry that the daughter, that carefully over-cultivated plant, sheltered from so many storms, has been broken in her mother's hand by a carelessness and a levity, pardonable perhaps in a woman in her 20s, but not one in her 40s. What has been and no longer is leaves no trace in the register. When someday Madame Sand thinks the matter over, she can have only kind memories of me in her soul. Meanwhile, she is now in the strangest paroxysm of motherhood, playing the part of a juster and better mother than she really is. And that is a fever for which there is no remedy in the case of heads with such an imagination when they have entered into such a quagmire. That's a very perceptive letter that Chopin writes to his sister about his kind of place in this and this kind of righteous indignation that Sand gave. Chopin, for his part, wrote a very beautiful waltz at this time. I think it's kind of the breakup waltz with Sand, and this is the famous waltz in the C-sharp minor, opus 64, number 2. I will play that now, written in 1847. So we've reached very much towards the end here. Unfortunately, the last couple of years after this breakup with Sand, Chopin gets into really dangerous states, very bad health. He's actually whisked away for a short time over to England by a woman named Jane Stirling, who was a Scottish pianist who had been studying with Chopin in Paris. She was very wealthy, probably was in love with Chopin, and saw this as an opportunity to bring him to England. The revolution of 1848 was also going on in Paris, so it was not easy for him to get any students to come. But he writes a couple of really fun things while he's in England. I'll read that and then play the last couple of pieces that he wrote, very short pieces. He said, here in England, there is no talk except about genealogy, the cousins of great families and great names that no one on the continent has ever heard of. Conversation is always entirely genealogical. It's like the Gospels. Who begat whom? He begat, and he begat, and he begat, and so on for 2 pages until you finally come to Jesus. He also was quite bored there in England. He found that what does he write about the cows here? The great thing about the cows. Here he goes. He says, the population here in England is ugly, but apparently good-natured. On the other hand, the cows are magnificent, but apparently inclined to gore people. He knows that the women are sort of attracted to him. He said that my Scottish ladies give me no peace at all. It was the sister as well. Either they come here to fetch me or they take me around to their families. They are stifling me out of courtesy, and out of the same courtesy, I do not refuse them. He also talks about, he says, every observation here in England ends with like water, meaning that it flows like water. I have not yet played to any Englishwoman without her saying to me, like water. They all look at their hands and play the wrong notes with so much feeling. They are eccentric folk, God help them. But ultimately, he realizes that it's not going to work out with Jane Stirling. He says about them, my Scottish women are kind, but so boring. Every day I get letters. I answer none of them. May God keep them in the good thoughts. What has become of my heart and my art? I scarcely remember anymore. The world slips away from me. I forget I have no strength. I am nearer to a coffin than I am to a marriage bed. And then when he gets back to Paris in 1849, he gets quite sick and spends the last couple months in bed. He dies soon after. His body is buried at the Père Lachaise cemetery there in Paris. But his heart was actually, he wanted it, he had in his will said, I want my heart to be taken out and sent back to Poland. So his sister actually came over. They took the heart out, and it's in the Holy, what is it, the Holy... something Holy Church in Warsaw, a Holy Spirit Church in Warsaw, in a pillar there, the heart of Chopin. So part of him is in Poland, part of him is in France. And I want to play the 2 last mazurkas that he wrote right before he dies, one in G minor, one in F minor, kind of a sad ending to Chopin. So a wonderful life that Chopin led, gave us so much great music. I want to thank you all for spending a couple hours here. It went a little longer than I thought, but that should be no surprise to those of you who know me. Again, thank you to Marcia Colligan for being there for 20 years, for having the idea to have the Chopin Salon in her house 20 years ago. For all of the board members, all of those who have given money in the past, who have done house concerts. We hope we can continue more. Again, if you want to make a donation to Classicopia, go to classicopia.org, press the yellow donate button. You can send a check to Marcia at 33 Rayton Road in Hanover, 03755. We will certainly hope to be in touch. Check out the new video page that I'm going to start building on the Classicopia website. And I hope all of you have a great Father's Day. I dedicate this program to my father who's watching up in heaven. Thank you for being so supportive. And I wish you all fantastic day, fantastic rest of your summer. Thanks for being a part of this. We'll see you soon.